Huh?
Uh, the World Trade Center, was that out of the blue also? And I would argue no. Of course, we've had other terrorist attacks before then. It's not the first time the World Trade Center was bombed, and we had plenty of warning. In fact, some people think we had a lot of warning about that. So no warfare or no conflict, I think, just appears from a vacuum. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of warning signs. There's a lot of things that are going on that causes nations or peoples or governments to start to become antagonistic and bellicose, if you want to use a fancy word.
I have a question for you, Nick.
Yeah.
In the Republican debates before the last presidential election, there was a presidential candidate who mentioned that our isolationism before World War II was what allowed Hitler to come into power. And that was an argument against an isolationist or a non-interventionist foreign policy.
Yeah.
Do you think that our isolationism was any sort of cause for Hitler's...
Or an enabler, at least.
Or an enabler?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's much historic evidence for that, and I'm not sure who said that or what, if they offered any proof. You know, again, in presidential debates, it's not necessarily that they're actually making a reasoned argument. It's just they're making an argument for effect. But look, the Nazi Party, again, it's another good example of how things develop over time. The Nazi Party was around for many, many years before it got into power, and it slowly built up more influence, and more people were interested in it. Certainly, economic conditions during the late 20s and the 1930s with a worldwide depression helped not just Hitler, not just Nazi Germany, but fascist Italy with Mussolini. There were many countries, including Great Britain, and you could even argue the United States, who became much more, the governments became much more larger, more controlling, much more laws. Economic trade was curtailed around the world. And again, all these, and many countries did this. The Czechoslovakia had a fascist government. Austria had a fascist government. Many countries around the world. Well, of course, we know China and Japan, and the Far East. So, yeah, it wasn't, Hitler in Nazi Germany wasn't an isolated incident by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, of course, not to belabor this, but these kinds of governments that were much more involved in economics during the 1930s, trying to help their people or trying to control trade, trying to keep jobs, this was a worldwide type of a phenomenon, and Nazi Germany was just one example of that. Many people, including people in the government, many big businessmen in the 1930s, for example, absolutely loved Mussolini and fascist Italy. It was held as an example of good government in the mid 1930s in this country, in our country.
Now, this was right after the Great Depression, which was a global event.
Or during the Great Depression, yes.
And do you think that the consolidation and the growth of government was a response to those economic conditions?
Absolutely. I think that's pretty clear, yes.
So do you think that if you wanted, and do you also think that that was the result of the eventual need for international intervention? And you know, do you think that that might have been, I've heard people say that that was kind of what caused the need for World War II, the economic conditions and the fallout of people who were desperate for unity and to keep what was theirs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to have non-interventionist foreign policy, you almost have to have conditions which allow for people to prosper.
I can't argue with that. And so that's what the fascism thing came from. It's the idea from the Roman times that somebody, one individual, perhaps a dictator, has that supreme power, that is supreme authority to do whatever they want to do.
And is this the sort of thing that our founders were trying to prevent?
Yes, I would think so. Yes, it's an easy question, right?
And
Just like in Vietnam, just like in Korea, just like in Central America, just like today when we endorse or support a specific Ukrainian leader, why do we do that in the first place?
Yeah, all good questions. I don't know all the answers.
Well, I mean, from what I understand, we were worried about the threat of the Soviet Union having influence over Central America, right? We
Yes.
didn't like that. We didn't like that. We wouldn't have liked that to have happened. The American government did not want that to happen, right?
I suppose, right.
And is it about because if Central America is in cahoots with Soviet Union, then Soviet Union's going to get all their coffee and we're not?
You're back to the economic arguments again. I don't know. Certainly, economic arguments are powerful. Economics is powerful, and yes, there's always this desire. Well, let's face it. If you can get something for free instead of having to pay for it,
Why do we care
you might do it.
Why do we care who the
You
leader of the Ukraine is?
I don't care who the leader of the Ukraine is.
But the American government does.
Right.
There's got to be a reason for that. We don't want. I assume the reason is more not that we mind, letting them choose their leader, but we don't want the Soviets to let them have their way over who it ends up. We don't want them being in cahoots with the Soviets. We want them in cahoots with us. That's what it's about, right? It's not about Ukraine. It's not about the Ukrainians. It's about them taking allegiance with one side or the other. And if it's them or us, well, then it better be us. But it seems like it all stems from America versus Russia.
Well, for most of my life, that's been true, but that hasn't been true for most of the time, the life of our country, by any means. I mean, it's not that Russia is this enemy of the United States from day one. It's Great Britain is our enemy.
Yeah.
They're our real enemy. They were the enemy that fought us, that we had to fight to get our independence, and then they attacked us again, and they burned down our capital in 1812. And those English are, they're our enemy. If you really want an enemy, I can't understand, frankly, really why we're not best friends with Russia. We should be. The Russians and the U.S. people have way more in common than we do. Each of us does with, say, China, in particular.
You gotta wonder if it's real or if it's just this false.
Well, it's funny being the only superpower left. I mean, we've got no other enemy to counterbalance us. And to justify a lot of the institutions that we created in the Cold War, you have to have an adversary. I mean, this is the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. It's big and it's tough to dismantle, and it takes years, decades even, people say, before you can take this huge pillar that's up against Russia and completely bring it down. What I think is interesting is that we were in a Cold War against a communist country for decades, and in that time we never had a financial collapse here in the United States. And nowadays we're drifting towards policies that are the same as the economic policies that they had in Russia. The communists didn't have a chance against us when we were more free and capitalist, and now that we're the only free capitalist, free trade country in existence, we're letting their philosophy into our nation.
Well, to have a global government, you got to even the playing field.
Good point. Of course, we aren't the only capitalist and free country, and of course, we're not anymore. We're not even the freest or the most capitalist in the world.